Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section of The Wanderer in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I also have a discussion of the painting by Casper David Friedrich, Wander Above the Sea of Fog, to accompany the section. So let's get started. The Wanderer. It was midnight when Zarathustra made his way over the ridge of the island, so that he might arrive at the other shore with the early dawn. For there he meant to board ship, for there was a good harbour at which foreign ships too liked to drop anchor, and they took on board many who wanted to leave the blissful islands and cross the sea. Now as Zarathustra was climbing the mountain, he recalled as he went the many lonely wanderings he had made from the time of his youth, and how many mountains and ridges and summits he had already climbed. "I am a wanderer and a mountain climber," he said to his heart. "I do not like the plains, and it seems I cannot sit still for long. And whatever may yet come to me as fate and experience, a wandering and a mountain climbing will be in it. In the final analysis, one experiences only oneself. The time has passed when accidents could befall me, and what could still come to me that was not already my own? It is returning. At last it is coming home to me, my own self, and those parts of it that have long been abroad and scattered among all things and accidents. And I know one thing more. I stand now before my last summit, and before the deed that has been deferred the longest. Alas, I have to climb my most difficult path. Alas, I have started upon my loneliest wandering. But a man of my sort does not avoid such an hour, the hour that says to him, 'Only now do you tread your path of greatness, the summit and abyss. They are now united in one. You are treading your path of greatness. Now what was formerly your ultimate danger has become your ultimate refuge. You are treading your path of greatness. Now it must call up all your courage that there is no longer a path behind you. You are treading your path of greatness. No one shall steal after you here. Your foot itself has extinguished the path behind you, and above that path stands written impossibility. And when all footholds disappear, you must know how to climb upon your own head. How could you climb upward otherwise? Upon your own head, and beyond your own heart. Now the gentlest part of you must become the hardest. He who has always been very indulgent with himself sickens at last through his own indulgence. All praise to what makes hard. I do not praise the land where butter and honey flow. In order to see much, one must learn to look away from oneself. Every mountain climber needs this hardness, but he who, seeking enlightenment, is over-eager with his eyes, how could he see more of a thing than its foreground? You, however, O Zarathustra, have wanted to behold the ground of things and their background. So you must climb above yourself, up and beyond, until you have even your stars under you. Yes, to look down upon myself, and even upon my stars, that alone I would call my summit. That has remained for me as my ultimate summit. So open in part 3 then, we have Zarathustra making his way along, climbing up mountains as he does, good old mountain climbing. Zarathustra making his way to a ship to leave the blissful islands that he's been on. And overall, he's starting to feel much better about himself. He's starting to come back to himself and going to be wanting to go places ultimately no people have treaded before. And so we have this whole sense of mountain climbing come out, and the whole aspect of sort of the metaphor really of knowledge itself being an arduous task in a way, and to really have a thing against plains, as he says, so ultimately flat land, because that's not what we want for Nietzsche. We don't want everything nice and comfortable and already done for us. We want a bit of a battle, we want a little bit of a struggle, we want a little bit of a challenge. Why is that the case? Because that means that it's all good stuff that we should be learning about in the first place. And then we have Zarathustra make the statements as well. He's going to be going uncharted paths, basically, and where it starts to get in the whole dangerous aspect of how you meant to have a foothold upon the mountain and make your way up it when no one else has done it before you, but you're going to be the first one there. He wants to be ultimately the first mountaineer to make his way up to the top. But we have then that great relation again into knowledge where he says in order to climb that mountain, in order to get to the top, you ultimately have to climb up upon your own head, which is kind of a strange statement in a way, but it's ultimately to therefore challenge our own views and own opinions and those views that we've grown up with and those social and cultural norms that sort of influence how we think. And it's in the way in which we have that fantastic relation between foreground and background that sort of developed out here as well. All that we ever see is ultimately just the foreground. So ultimately that which is nearest to us within our own given society and culture and so on. But what we want to get towards is a background as well. And so having a much fuller grasp of things as well. And once we do, therefore we're able to come back to our own views and rethink them because we've been able to grasp the whole picture ultimately. And so there's that whole wonderful idea of Zarathustra challenging himself, climbing up over his own head, going towards the stars to kick us off. So continuing on then, thus spoke Zarathustra to himself as he climbed, consoling his heart with hard sayings, for his heart was wounded as never before. And when he arrived at the top of the mountain ridge, behold, there lie the other sea spread out before him. And he stood and was long silent. But the night at this height was cold and clear and bright with stars. I know my fate, he said at last with sadness. Well then, I am ready. My last solitude has just begun. Ah, this sorrowful black sea beneath me. Ah, this brooding reluctance. Ah, destiny and sea. Now I have to go down to you. I stand before my highest mountain and my longest wandering. Therefore I must first descend deeper than I have ever descended. Deeper into pain than I have ever descended, down to its blackest stream, so my destiny will have it. Well then, I am ready. Whence arise the highest mountains? I once asked. Then I learned that they arise from the sea. This testimony is written into their stones and into the sides of their summits. The height must arise to its height from the deepest. Thus spoke Zarathustra on the mountain summit, where it was cold. When he drew near to the sea, however, and at length stood alone beneath the cliffs, he had grown weary on the way and more yearning than he was before. Everything is still asleep, he said. Even the sea is asleep. Its eye looks at me, drowsily and strangely. But it breathes warmly, I feel it. And I feel, too, that it is dreaming. Dreaming it rise upon a hard pillow. Listen, listen, how it groans with wicked memories, or with wicked expectations. Ah, I am sad with you, dark monster, and angry even with myself for your sake. Alas, that my hand has insufficient strength. In truth, I should dearly like to release you from your bad dreams. And as Zarathustra thus spoke, he laughed at himself with melancholy and bitterness. What, Zarathustra, he said, do you want to sing consolation even to the sea? Ah, you fond fool, Zarathustra, too eager to trust. But that is what you have always been. You have always approached trustfully all that is fearful. You have always wanted to caress every monster, a touch of warm breath, a little soft fur on its paw, and at once you have been ready to love and entice it. Love is the danger for the most solitary man. Love of anything, if only it is alive. Indeed, my foolishness and modesty in love is laughable. Thus spoke Zarathustra and laughed again. But then he thought of the friends he had left, and was angry with himself because of his thoughts, as if he had injured his friends with them. And forthwith the laughing man wept, for anger and longing did Zarathustra weep bitterly. And so for the next part then, we have Zarathustra looking down at the sea, and we have this wonderful relationship between the mountains and the sea that happens. Where arise the highest mountains? They come from the sea. And it's the interesting sort of relationship that philosophy has with this whole idea of the sea. And one idea that immediately pops into my head is from Plato, where he talks about a sea of ignorance. And that's the way in which everybody runs around in a very general opinions about things, which of course can be proven to be completely false. And then what we ultimately must do is move from that sea into knowledge. And so moving from this whole massive sense of general opinions onto land ultimately. And the land will be away from everybody else who are stuck in the sea. So we can say that where does ultimately knowledge come from and develop from is that relation back into society and having that relation back into social, cultural norms, political problems, and so forth. And therefore we treat the sea as this sort of big, monstrous creature as well. And if only Zarathustra can soothe the sea, if only somehow they could make it better and less, let's say, choppy or stormy. But it's that sort of laughter he has upon himself, because at the same time, it's that critical reflection he has to say, well, why? Why do you need to go and try to caress every monster? Isn't love the most dangerous thing for the solitary man? And it's to say, well, why do you always need to want to have people agree with you as well? Why do you always have to try to always go out and fix everything? Ultimately, you could say, well, is Zarathustra's job to be like Bob the Builder, running around trying to fix everything? Can he fix it? He doesn't need to, ultimately, is what the reply back to that is. Sorry, Bob the Builder. Because if he tries to, it goes into the whole idea, well, love is a dangerous thing by itself, because if you force through the whole idea of you must love it, you have to love something, then it automatically goes into the whole ideas of obeying and therefore others submitting to exactly what's said because they should feel the same amount of passion and love that you do. And of course, you don't have to do it on a political level, but of course it can go into that. But you could just do it on a just simple, someone getting really overly obsessive about a specific sports team, and therefore every other friend that you have has to love the sports team to the same degree and passion that you do. And it's sort of, that's what's so funny that Nietzsche picks up upon is, no, we don't need that. In fact, that's laughable to have that idea in the first place, because we allow for that diversity and for each to love things in our own different ways from each other. So overall then we have Zarathustra wanting to then go down and descend from the mountain again. And of course there's that whole point is, why does he therefore subject himself and willingly want to go into deeper into pain than he's ever descended, and therefore just go down even deeper than ever before? Because he could just stay there on top of the mountain quite happily and therefore live out the rest of his life in solitude. But this whole idea going deeper and we must have to go down into and descend into things goes back into whole Nietzsche's idea of knowledge itself isn't something that's just flat. So it goes into this whole idea of where you can have philosophy itself, and what it tries to do is therefore create this nice plane or nice landscape in which there is no bumps. Everything's nice and hunky-dory. But what Nietzsche says is what we need to do is start digging underneath and descending underneath things, because once we do so, then we act more like a structural engineer in a way, and a bit of a mountaineer of knowledge also, and to therefore start showing, well, actually, what we thought was nice and hunky-dory actually does have a lot of bumps and a lot of structural flaws that's happening here. And one of the main things that Nietzsche has as well as a tool that was developed is genealogy. And of course, one of his main books is Genealogy of Morals, in which we think of morality in this very pure way, absolute good, absolute evil. But the main purpose of that is to descend, ultimately go under, and therefore dig underneath the whole ideas themselves. And once you do that, therefore you discover that they're not pure whatsoever. They have a history to them. There's specific reasons for why we think in a given time period that we do, and why certain things are good in a time period and why those things are bad in another time period. And so it's just this whole idea of descending and going down is a necessary thing, because also knowledge shouldn't be something that's comfortable either, as he says. And it's that whole sort of laughter, the sense of, in a part, knowledge itself tries to be comfortable by providing a solution within the section, between him wanting to go down in the first place, wanting to console the ocean, this monstrous ocean that he's looking at. And it's like, well, it's absurd at the same time to think that one person can control or have any sort of semblance of control over such a thing like that. Because all what we do, of course, is just touch upon a very small aspect of it. We only touch upon the foregrounds of things, and what we must do, of course, is get the full picture and therefore have the nice background included as well, to touch upon the nice concepts that was discussed in the section. And so a great example for this section, I thought, was to discuss the painting by Casper David Friedrich, Wander Above the Sea of Fog, 1817. And there's a great wee article as well written on it by Cody Delistraty that's on the parisreview.org website. So I'm just going to read a couple little paragraphs that starts off the article as well. So in Casper David Friedrich's most famous painting, Wander Above the Sea of Fog, the German romantic artist depicts a young, aristocratic-looking man in a green overcoat as he stands atop a jagged rock, taking in a misty, high-altitude scene of mountains and cliffs. The image shows a moment of ultimate self-reflection in the vein of Immanuel Kant, a privileged man working out his interior feelings through exterior romantic symbolism. The fog parts are him, but only just so, revealing not verdant hills and lush forests, but dense mountainsides and jagged rocks. The man is at once a master of the universe and entirely subservient to it. Even from high above, he could only see a challenging sliver of what he might otherwise think he controls. Today, Friedrich's painting has a postcard feel about it. It has been so distilled to its narrative essence of soul-searching and travel that the actual strokes, the artistic style, cease to matter. Instead, it functions as a symbolic stand-in for European romanticism and ideals of wanderlust at large. It is a historical guidepost that acts as the hinge between the late 18th century German Sturm und Drang, Storm and Stress movement, which manifested in visual art as scenes of storms and shipwrecks representing the awesome power of nature's irrational destruction, and the later romantic depiction which, as in Friedrich's painting, with a silhouetted figure allowed the viewer to read the natural scene as representative of a subjective internal human state. And what's great about the painting as well, you can very much get the sort of Zarathustra feeling when you have a look at it as well, with the aristocratic man standing on top of the mountain, and with Zarathustra loving his mountain so much, and especially when he's looking out at the sea in this section as well, you can get definitely the feeling of this section when you have a look at the painting. And also you have a sense of this section as well when you have that whole relation into the self and the whole aspect of looking at nature and therefore having a deeper introspection about your own self through viewing nature itself. But on the other hand, what's also important for Nietzsche is not simply the mountain climbing and getting to the top, but also the whole going down. And so really, if we were to say it was more of a Nietzsche style of painting, it would be that aspect of the struggle and not simply just this whole aristocratic man looking out upon the world as he does, but rather somebody who's very much struggling and toiling and only have those brief moments of respite ultimately. And this quite nicely fits into another article that deals with the painting, which is entitled Wander Above the Sea of Fog, the Ubermensch and the Unconscious by Kevin Shaw from medium.com. And getting to the heart of the matter as well, as it states here, the painting of the wanderer above the sea of fog is a work of creative exploration and an internal integration, an artistic expression of a higher self, the supreme wisdom of total integration which forms the basis for real individualism. The fully integrated individual constitutes a higher man, what Friedrich Nietzsche would later call an Ubermensch, overman, superman, who is able to transcend his mere humanity. And so we can quite critically engage with that article as well, because the whole aspect of the overman or superman in Nietzsche is not to move from man into a higher state, but ultimately reconstituting or reconstructing or taking apart and putting together the very idea of what man is to begin with. Because the very idea of going higher in Nietzsche is the laughable point, is because we can't go higher, because if you try to go higher, what do you ultimately do is you end up with completely nothing at all. You would end up with just a complete state of complete pitch blackness around you, because what is everything that makes up everything around us is precisely the world. And you need all that foreground and background in order to have the complete picture in the first place. So ultimately, what the whole point about the man standing on top of the mountain is only representing one part of the journey. The other half would be that whole aspect of going down. And this was reflective back into the very start in the prologue, where Zarathustra comes down from the mountain in the first place. Philosophy isn't this idea of having this ethical model that you then teach and later people will adopt. Rather, philosophy is very much this tactile, fragile thing that is only good as it is practical and viable for people at a given time period. And so, when we come down to the idea of what man is or what humanity is in this given idea, is like the man on the mountain in Casper David Friedrich's painting who looks upon the world. And we have the very idea in German ideology, one of the main philosophical tenets coming out of the whole German Romantic period as well, as ultimately the human mind enabling us to understand and therefore structure the world as it conforms to how we understand and think about it. But rather, Nietzsche twists that and turns it around and is to say, well, actually the world has an immense effect upon those structures of knowledge themselves. They are not these big massive concrete pillars that are immovable, that are never going to be subject to change or will collapse or suddenly will be impractical and people will just completely get rid of them and this whole idea will have absolutely no purpose in the future. Hence why you go into the very idea of God is dead is because Nietzsche says we've run into a problem within contemporary society because previously the model for God worked, but now with the progression of science, there needs to be a whole different way in which we need to think about religion. Why is that the case? Because it can't serve as the ultimate function like it did before. And it's not only, of course, with religion, but all forms of knowledge as well, that it only has this very specific, almost time stamp upon it, because it's only as good as it's going to be useful and practical for people. And so when we have this idea of man out looking upon the world, it's rather the Nietzsche point is to say, well, knowledge is rather like sandcastles, and the whole point of knowledge is to go down in the first place, because then we have the whole effect of how we think in the very first place at work, and knowledge itself suddenly becoming affected by the world and movement and change and so on. And so nicely sort of wrapping it up as well, as we could say, well, what is the idea of man? Not something that should be aspired to in a very much higher sense, but kind of rather like what Nietzsche himself does, sort of analyze his own contemporary period, thinks about the problems, the whole aspects and problems of nihilism that's emerged. Why is that? Why is there so much a focus upon metaphysics? Tracing it back to Plato as he does historically. And therefore the whole aspect of how do we reinvigorate humanity out of this nihilism or nihilistic state is one of the big questions that drives Nietzsche's philosophy. And so Nietzsche's philosophy overall is a sort of against the idea of ideality, taking higher ideals, placing this whole emphasis upon specific concepts. And therefore, when we come into the idea of humanity, we have to get underneath things and look at the historical reasons and look at genealogy, ultimately, of ourselves in order to understand why we're in this given situation. And so it's never the aspect of a going upward, but always in the sense of challenging that upward movement by going downward. And that quite nicely goes into the next little part called Of the Vision and the Riddle, where there's this upward and downward sort of fight that happens. But let's leave that for the next episode. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the section, The Wanderer in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. Feel free to also drop me a wee email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. And I can be also found on Twitter at I am a Rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.